Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about peace and conflict in the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. The news media typically responds to crises. When India-based reporter Amy Yee got a call from her editor to cover a press conference with the Dalai Lama, she stopped what she was doing and booked the next flight. She was headed for Dharamsala, where the Buddhist leader and thousands of Tibetan refugees make their home. The Dalai Lama was responding to violence in Tibet, where demonstrations against Chinese rule led to a government crackdown. At least 120 people had died, mostly ethnic Tibetans. On that first visit to Dharamsala, Amy was struck by the throngs of Tibetans protesting peacefully in the streets. She was also surprised when the Dalai Lama approached her after the press conference, asked if she was Chinese, and then embraced her in a warm hug. A few months later, Amy Yee quit her job at the Financial Times and became a freelance reporter. She moved to this small city in the foothills of the Himalayas. She writes that Dharamsala, it's a unique microcosm of a culture fighting for survival. Her new book, Far from the Rooftop of the World, travels among Tibetan refugees on 4 continents, follows the stories of ordinary Tibetans who've lived extraordinary lives. It also documents this community in exile, its education system, self-expression, and nonviolent resistance. In this second episode in our series on refugees and immigration, we take a look at what it means to build a new life when you may never be able to go home, and how Tibetans have forged their own path in India and elsewhere. Our show's producer, Andrea Maraskin, spoke with Amy Yee.
Amy Yee, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start with something that you've said in previous interviews about what kept you going writing the book and trying to get it published. It was the resilience and the inspiration of the people that you followed in your reporting of the Tibetans who you followed over the years. So let's start there. Can you tell me about one of the characters in the book who inspired you?
Yes, so one of the people I met in the book, we meet him in the first chapter. In the book, his name is Topden. And he is a monk I met in 2008 in Dharamsala in India. And his story was that when he was a young man, maybe 18 or 19 or so, he and his cousin decided that they would leave their home in Tibet. They were already monks, and they thought they would go to India where they could study Tibetan Buddhism freely and practice it freely. And so they left Tibet and they walked for 23 days over icy mountain passes and glaciers and walking furtively, often at night, to avoid government patrols. And then when he arrived in first Nepal and then went on to India, he lived in a monastery in southern India. And when I met him in Dharamsala, years later, he had come up to Dharamsala so that he could learn English. And so we meet him in the very first pages. And within the first couple pages, I did say to him, so you don't dislike Chinese people? You're not afraid of them? And I asked that because I am ethnically Chinese. I'm Chinese American, born and raised in Boston. And Topden and I were watching a basketball game in Dharamsala. He's very into basketball. And, he kind of pulled his eyes away from the basketball game. And he said, no, I don't dislike Chinese people. We don't like the government. We don't like China's government. But I'm not afraid of Chinese people and I don't dislike them. And then he went back to watching the basketball game. So, he was always a very even-keeled and very friendly and easy person to be around in spite of having left so much behind. He was never able to see his family again back in Tibet. There was another Tibetan I met, and he's in the second chapter in the book. His name is Norbu, and so he went through so much when he decided to leave Tibet. He was a young boy of about 13 or 14 when he was inadvertently near a protest that happened in Lhasa, in the capital of Tibet. And he said he wasn't part of the protest, but he was swept up in police sweep and then was arrested and imprisoned for about 3 months, where he was beaten and interrogated. And when he got out of jail, he was still a kid and he couldn't go back to school. So he was blacklisted from school. He tried to go to another school. Again, he was blacklisted. When he tried to do some odd jobs or find some work, Chinese authorities would stop him. So there weren't many prospects for him, and his family was extremely distraught. He said his mother was crying all the time, and his brother suggested to him, maybe you should go to India, where he would have more future prospects. And so he, didn't want to leave, but sort of had to. And again, he walked with a group of people, I think 17 days. And when he arrived in India, finally, he had a very hard transition. So he was physically sick. He wasn't used to the food. Of course, he couldn't speak English or any Indian languages, and his schooling had been cut off when he was still a boy. So he had a lot to catch up on, and he enrolled in a special school called the transit school, which is for older students, and he had to catch up on a lot. But there he did learn English. He also found his way to a nonprofit group in Dharamsala that works with former political prisoners, and they helped with vocational training, job training, and so he learned to be a chef. And so when I met him in Dharamsala, he was working as a chef in a restaurant.
Amy, your book is called Far from the Rooftop of the World, Travels Among Tibetan Refugees on 4 Continents. How is it that so many Tibetans fled Tibet and became refugees, and why do they remain refugees today?
Yeah, so just the very short story is that in 1959, China's military took over Tibet. There had already been some occupation of Chinese troops in Tibet, but 1959 marked the forceful takeover. And when that happened, the Dalai Lama decided to flee. And so that was after some, a process of decision-making from the oracle and other advisors he had. And so he clandestinely fled Tibet. And so he left, and then thousands and tens of thousands of Tibetans followed him. And so the fear was that if the Dalai Lama had stayed, there was a lot of fear about what might happen to him. And Tibetans were also in fear for their lives and also left. So, at least 100,000 Tibetans have left Tibet since 59. And just to give you a sense of what was going on, since then, about 1.2 million Tibetans have died because of that conflict. And so much was happening in China at that time, too. It was full of turmoil after a civil war and so on. And so, also 47 million Chinese people have died since 1948. So that gives you a sense of the turmoil of what was happening.
So the beginning of your book and much of the book takes place in Dharamsala, where there's this large Tibetan refugee community and a government in exile. Can you situate us a bit there? It seems really interesting, these beautiful Himalayan views and this sort of mix of Tibetans, tourists, students of Buddhism, and Indians. What was it like, and how did these groups intermingle and get along while you were there?
Yeah, so the town of Dharamsala is in the foothills of the Himalayas. To get there, I would take a bus from Delhi, the capital of India, and it was a 12-hour overnight bus ride up these winding mountain roads. And so Dharamsala itself, before 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled to India, it was actually a ghost town because there had been a huge earthquake in the early 1900s that wiped out the population. And so it was really quite deserted. And then I think in 1960 is when the Dalai Lama came to Dharamsala. So over the years, over the decades, the population has grown. And when the Dalai Lama became more and more famous and celebrated, more people started to go there who were not Tibetan or Indian. So that's when you do get more tourists. It's become a sort of spiritual hub as well. So like you said, the exile government is there. And at the time when I was there, were about 10,000 Tibetans living in Dharamsala and also Indians. So it's a really interesting little place. And the main area, which is very Tibetan, is called Ganj, and it's quite small. So it's like 3 main roads that converge in this square that's very congested. And I would bump into people all the time, just walking along these roads and see the same people over and start chatting with them. It does have these beautiful views of snow-capped mountains in the distance, and there are these hills and everything. But, it's a congested Indian town. So the roads are really narrow. It wasn't this Shangri-La or anything.
So about the government in exile, what is a government in exile? It even has a prime minister. I mean, how does it work? What does it mean to be a government in exile?
Well, for the Tibetan government in exile, it does mean that they administer a lot of their own affairs. But first, I should say they don't have, let's say like political and economic power in India. They are still under the Indian legal system. So they administer a lot of their own affairs in the Tibetan settlements. Tibetans do not only live in Dharamsala, they live in settlements in many other states across India, far from the mountains. They do administer their Tibetan school system, the monasteries, a system of voting for Tibetans who are registered. They do meet with governments overseas as well. They recently met with members of the U.S. Congress, for example.
Something that really struck me was this boarding school system and the fact that Tibetan parents, in addition to refugees who made the difficult journey across the mountains to India and stayed, there were parents who would make a similar journey to drop their children off at a boarding school, Tibetan boarding school in India, and then go back home to Tibet. Why do you think they made such a dangerous journey to take their children to boarding school in India?
I think that says a lot about the situation in Tibet and what parents were willing to do for their children. So parents will often do that and take that journey because they want their children to be educated in a Tibetan system where they can learn about Tibetan history, culture, religion, traditions, geography in a way that they couldn't within Tibet itself, within their very own homeland. Now, the flow of people coming from Tibet has definitely diminished from when I first was writing about this, and that's because of crackdown from China's government.
So the Dalai Lama wrote the foreword to your book, and then you began the tale with the story of you visiting a press conference where he came up to you right after and pinched your cheeks, and there was an adorable viral photo that's still out there. I don't know if we can get your permission to publish it with this episode. But, he's obviously an important part of the story. How important has the Dalai Lama and by extension Tibetan Buddhist institutions been to spreading and preserving Tibetan culture in exile?
Well, the Dalai Lama's influence is essential. It's hard to articulate how important it is. And just to go back to that scene in March 2008, I was assigned to get up to Dharamsala to write about what was happening in Tibet. And in March 2008, there were protests within Tibet that had become violent. And so many journalists, a lot of foreign correspondents for Western media were sent up there. And I was told just the day before, I think in the afternoon, to get up to Dharamsala the next morning. And I was all the way down in the south of India at the time, in Karnataka.
Working for the Financial Times, right?
Yes, I was working for the Financial Times and didn't necessarily know much about Dharamsala, and then had to get up there by the next morning, which was quite a trek. And so I was late for the press conference, and by the time I got there, there were no seats left, and so I sat on the floor near the Dalai Lama, and he could see me pretty clearly, and I had asked a question. By the time the press conference finished, he came back to me, made a beeline towards me, and was really excited to see someone who's ethnically Chinese. And he did say, "Chinese?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'm American." But he was still excited to meet someone ethnically Chinese. And that's when he grabbed my cheeks, and he looked into my eyes, and he said, "China and Tibet, we must discuss. It's between us and you must tell them. And because all the photographers were there, like from Associated Press and Reuters, they took these photos, and that photo went out on newspapers and wire services around the world. So that's the very start of the book and my introduction to Dharamsala. And so back to your question about the Dalai Lama, although he starts the book and he did write the foreword, I wanted to write a book that was about ordinary Tibetan people. There are quite a few books about Tibet, but not so many about Tibetans in exile, especially ordinary Tibetans, meaning not the high-level activists or members of government, just regular people. And that's what I gravitate towards normally in my journalism as well.
And another thing that was kind of remarkable was that there's this welcome center for newly arrived Tibetan refugees in Dharamsala, and people will wait for an audience with the Dalai Lama. He'll come in and address them as an intro and welcome to India.
Yeah, that's right. So they usually wait at, it's called the reception center in Dharamsala, and it's sort of like a dormitory, and people will stay there until the Dalai Lama can address them in person. But that first meeting with him is a bond that they share. And I did get to observe one of those audiences with a group of Tibetans who had just arrived. And the Dalai Lama was quite different in that setting. So I think a lot of people, especially in the West, think of the Dalai Lama as this sort of laughing, cuddly, Buddha-like person. But in that setting, when he was greeting the newly arrived Tibetans, he was very serious, very urgent in his tone, as though imparting advice to children you might not see again, like everything you need to tell your child in like 5 or 10 minutes or so. And actually, he exhorted them to study. That was the most important thing that he underscored in that talk. So many Tibetan people I met had talked about the Dalai Lama and how they looked to him, how they had a lot of anger or, were not well mentally. There was an older woman I met who had a lot of trauma, but she said that through the Dalai Lama's teachings and his encouragement, she was able to let go of her anger. And this was someone who had been imprisoned for, I think, 27 years. And, when she got out of prison, her own children didn't recognize her. So she had been through so much, but she said specifically that it was the Dalai Lama who helped her let go of that anger and move on and be more constructive in her life.
So you mentioned the 2008 violent protests in Tibet and the violence of the police crackdowns there in China. And then you also reported on in your book nonviolent protests in Dharamsala in solidarity. Can you talk a bit about nonviolent resistance among Tibetans?
Yeah, so this was one of the things that really struck me when I first arrived in Dharamsala. So I described the scene where I was late to the press conference, but part of the reason that contributed to my tardiness was that there were throngs of people in the streets of Dharamsala, marching, rallying, holding signs, holding banners, doing all kinds of protests. And then during my time in Dharamsala, I had seen things like hunger strikes and other kinds of rallies and vigils, marches. So all of those things were on full display. And so that's one of the things that really struck me when I arrived in Dharamsala, is that in the homeland, in Tibet itself, you could be arrested or worse for what they were doing in Dharamsala, in this parallel universe. And that's why we were seeing such a, violent repression of the protest in Tibet. And then here on the other side is where you could see, on full display, how Tibetan identity, culture, and resistance could be expressed freely.
Would you like to read a passage from the book?
Yeah, so I did meet a lot of different kinds of groups who were involved in nonviolent resistance and teaching it and implementing it. And so in 2009, I wrote an article about this issue, about this subject for The Nation, where I talked about the different techniques and trainings that groups like Students for Free Tibet or the Tibetan Youth Congress were using. And remember that we're in India, which is such a home of nonviolent protest with Gandhi, and Gandhi's influence was definitely there. So I met a couple from Massachusetts, Everett and Mary Gendler. Everett used to be a rabbi, and his wife is named Mary, and she was a psychologist. And they founded a nonprofit called the Active Nonviolence Education Center. And when I met Everett, he was about 80 at the time and retired. And this was part of his retirement is teaching nonviolent resistance to Tibetans in workshops. And so something really memorable was watching a workshop that they held, and the Gendlers were talking about the teachings of Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp was a Boston-based intellectual who outlined 198 methods of nonviolent action in his 1973 book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. So I'll just read a little bit from watching one of these workshops. One cold winter day, white-haired Everett Gendler, dressed in a plaid flannel shirt, corduroy pants, and sturdy hiking boots, led a classroom discussion of 20 young Tibetans who sat in chairs arranged in a circle. I observed while he asked what the word power meant to them. The students were silent and shy at first. Many of them were from farming or nomadic communities, and even for those from Tibetan cities had limited education. But the students warmed up, as one by one they went around the circle and shared telling responses. Power means, quote, something frightening, said one young woman in soft English. Power means something bad or evil. It means violence and someone who monitors things, other students offered. At the start of the workshop, it wasn't clear how much the students would get out of the discussions. Did Gene Sharp's lessons on teach-ins and walkouts really matter when protests in Tibet were violently snuffed out? Would talking about power shake a powerful establishment armed with guns and soldiers? Cynics would say no, it didn't promote freedom in Tibet, and in fact, repression had worsened in recent months. But training helped promote resistance and exile, and the Tibet in this parallel existence in India had an impact on the world, judging from media coverage and the discussions and passions it sparked. There was a Tibetan couple I met in the winter of 2008, and they had just arrived in India as a result of those March 2008 protests because they had helped a Tibetan friend photocopy some flyers. That friend was arrested, and as soon as he was arrested, they decided they had to leave Tibet. But when they first arrived in Dharamsala, they were surprised at all the protests and marches. Like they had never seen anything like that, right? Because in Tibet, it would be snuffed out very quickly. And so at first they were like, what good does this do? And then they realized sort of what I just described, that it creates momentum, it generates media coverage. There's something for people to talk about. So they realized that it is important, and they could only sort of see that in exile when they were out of Tibet itself.
While we're here, let's get into the conversation you had with a Chinese democracy activist. This was a man, was it Qin Jin?
Yes, that's right.
Qin Jin is originally from China, had gone to Australia to study, and by the time you met him was living in Australia and came to Dharamsala and was talking about this idea that there's no free Tibet without a free China.
So yes, I did meet Chinese democracy activists in Dharamsala, which was unexpected. The Chinese democracy activists were there for a big meeting that was happening in the fall of 2008, where different Tibet support groups were meeting in this time of crisis in Tibet to discuss what they were working on and a way forward. That's why I encountered them. And, they saw themselves very much allied with the Tibetan cause because fundamentally it's what they want. They want human rights. They want freedom to express themselves freely, freedom to move around, freedom to think and not live in fear. I think most ordinary Chinese people would agree with that fundamentally. And so it was a different way to look at the relationship between Chinese and Tibetans, that Chinese people have also been repressed as well. Perhaps they don't talk about it as much, or maybe they don't think of it that way. But, especially these days, there are plenty of Chinese people who are ethnically Han Chinese who are also imprisoned or disappeared or repressed. That ranges from ordinary citizens who protested against COVID lockdowns to Christian Chinese, and Christian churches are also surveyed and sometimes have to operate underground, or members of the Falun Gong. So the way that Jinjin talked about Tibetans was that, of course they should be able to practice their religion freely and preserve their culture. These are fundamental human rights. And the other interesting thing about the Chinese democracy activists is that on the 50th anniversary of the Tibetan exile, which was in March of 2009, that was a big milestone, a really momentous occasion. And the Dalai Lama presided over a big ceremony in the morning. And on the stage with him, he actually sat, I think a dozen of these Chinese democracy activists on stage with him. And looking back, it is quite remarkable to think that, think of the other conflicts in the world. Would a leader of the side that's being oppressed welcome on stage people, members of quote unquote the other side, even if they're not the government, right? It's still this incredible bridging. And the Dalai Lama is very adamant and passionate about reaching out to Chinese people. And he has said that his faith in the Chinese government is getting thinner and thinner, but he still has faith in Chinese people. I should also say that that was a message that seemed like Tibetans took that to heart, because Tibetans I met in Dharamsala or across India or in exile in Australia, they greeted me very warmly and welcomed me. I never felt hostility or animosity from them. In fact, sometimes they seemed a little disappointed that I was American and not actually a Chinese person from China. like they were excited when they initially thought I was Chinese from China. But I don't know, American is not as interesting. So it's a really incredible message and example.
It's so hard to get reliable news out of China these days. I think you mentioned state surveillance. And we've been hearing more about certain minority groups like the Uyghurs in particular, and to the extent to which they're surveilled. And some people use the word cultural genocide, which has also gone on in Tibet. But the Chinese government on the world stage seems, to have even gotten more powerful, even though it's somewhat opaque from here. What is the state of the Tibetan cause right now, given all these things that have changed since you wrote the book?
China's government and the Communist Party have grown more repressive since I wrote the book, since the current administration came to power. And that's been going on for the last 10 years or so. And some of the repression and crackdowns are extremely shocking. Could not have imagined that. Even at the time when I was reporting on Tibet, like in 2009, at the time there was an estimated 6,500 Tibetans who had been arrested by the spring of March 2009, arrested or detained. And that seemed like a very large figure. And fast forward to 2018, when there were an estimated 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in detention camps, basically imprisoned. I mean, 1 million. That's really unbelievable. It's really hard to wrap your head around those numbers. So the oppression has gotten worse. I think what you've also seen in Hong Kong has been really shocking and also unimaginable. Probably people did not think China would crack down on Hong Kong because, it is a financial engine. And then just about your question about the state of the Tibetan movement, I don't think the Tibetan movement has waned. So news media, we react to crises, as we know. So if there's a news event, journalists are sent to cover it, like was the case with me in Dharamsala in 2008. And there are many things that are competing for headlines in the media. The Tibet issue still gets covered compared to other conflicts in the world that really don't get coverage. But there are other acute crises that take over the headlines. For sure, there's still very active activism and advocacy And actually, other media outlets do cover it very routinely. Outlets like Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Voice of Tibet. There are lots of outlets that focus on Tibetan news. Also important to note is I don't think that support of Tibet has waned. As I mentioned before, members of the Tibetan exile government do meet with members of the U.S. Congress, for example. They met with like Nancy Pelosi and others just last year. They are still well received, and I believe there's still quite a bit of financial support. That's extremely important. A lot of financial support comes from the U.S. government.
Yes, and you mentioned that the school system gets a lot of NGO support.
Yes, so the school system and Tibet issues and the exile government, they get support from the U.S. and they get support from India, actually. So I don't know if that financial support has waned. There are these extensive Tibetan schools across India. I did visit the flagship school in Dharamsala. It's called Tibetan Children's Village, and that's the one that most people think of. But there are, dozens of schools across India as well as in Nepal and Bhutan. And I could say for Tibetan Children's Village, TCV, in Dharamsala, that the preservation of Tibetan language and education, culture, and so on, it's pretty extraordinary. In fact, I profiled a couple who had just recently left Tibet in 2008, Deki and Dundap. Deki's written Tibetan, I don't think was very strong because she had never learned Tibetan formally in school in Tibet. I mean, she could speak Tibetan fluently, but I think that for Tibetans who are educated at TCV, I think their written Tibetan may be better than someone like Deki.
I thought this was an interesting quote from your intro. I tried to strike a balance between journalistic objectivity and personal involvement. I mostly wanted to be a fly on the wall, but sometimes I became a fly in the soup. Can you tell me about a time you became a fly in the soup?
Yes. So there were many moments, but the most illustrative example is in a chapter of the book called Money Matters. And Deki, the Tibetan woman I just mentioned who fled Tibet in 2008, Deki and her husband encountered some legal issues and they asked me to help them. Basically, they had worked at a call center in India and they were really happy to get a job and to make money. But it turns out that the manager of the call center never paid them. They and other Tibetans had never been paid by their boss, so this was a case of wage theft. And at first, when Deki asked me to help her, I just thought, what can I do? Don't think I can help here. And she kind of then just gave me the phone number of her former boss and said to call him. And so I write about this in the book, and especially in that chapter. And, the manager hung up on me when I told him who I was. But that was just the start. I then started to get involved with their situation, and it turns out that I could help them. And that's why I introduced them to this Indian legal aid lawyer who's in the book. And so in that situation, I'm not a journalist reporting about politicians or a world leader like the Dalai Lama. In that situation, I was more like a travel writer on a journey with these people, and I'm documenting what happens. And in those chapters, kind of shifts to being more like a narrative, more like a travel narrative, except most travel narratives don't document what happens when you're trying to solve a wage theft situation and arguing with a combative lawyer. So that was a situation where I became a fly in the soup.
Well, Amy, the book is really beautifully written and fascinating. It's also very accessible. So thank you so much for the book, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. So appreciate you in this podcast and the focus of your work on these messages of peace. I mean, it's perhaps harder to write about these issues, but I mean, isn't that what we want? I think people want peace. They don't want conflict ultimately. So anything that sheds light on that is so important.
Amy Yee is an award-winning journalist currently reporting for the Chicago Sun-Times. You can find an archive of her reporting and learn more about her book, Far from the Top of the World, at amyyeewrites.com. The book is available in paperback and as an ebook from the University of North Carolina Press. Next time on Making Peace Visible, a very special interview with peace builder William Ury. Bill's many accomplishments include founding the program on negotiation at Harvard, co-writing the bestseller Getting to Yes, and helping President Juan Manuel Santos negotiate Colombia's historic 2016 peace agreement with the FARC. I speak with him about his new book, Possible: How We Survive and Thrive in an Age of Conflict. That episode is out May 7th. Our podcast is produced and edited by Andrea Maraskin, with help from Faith McClure. Stephen Youngblood is the Associate Director of Making Peace Visible, and I'm Jamil Simon. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.